the reason all these projects are going on for rewilding and buying out farms, et cetera, is to put the new growing zone in North African Sahel and control it as a single distribution point for the world's food supply. And if you don't play ball, then they would simply cut your country off because they want to consolidate all the world's food production in North Africa Sahel, part of the Middle East, which is larger than North America and Canada combined, and they can get a double rotation crop. So I don't know, it keeps coming right back to food.
Civilization Cycle interviews experts and individuals who understand the intensifying cycle of economic, societal, and government upheaval, so you can stay ahead of the changes in our world and keep your family safe. Fortunately for us, we can recognize that we're at the precipice, a point in history where we can all see the cycle changing. Where we go from here is up to us. So let's start the conversation, and welcome to the show.
Joining us for the first time on Geopolitics and Empire is David DuByne of the Adapt 2030 channel and Civilization Cycle podcast, where he discusses timelines for what you can expect from now through 2030 as society resets so you can keep your families safe. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, David.
Thanks for having me on. And, you see the world moving in a different direction. And, when we were on a show previously together, we were sort of saying that it was going to move out. Food shortages, or not global famine, but food shortages and inavailability of food was going to start to rear its head, and you're going to look for massive price increases that would affect the greater economy. And then here we are now, where people complain every day, and they have those memes. The most expensive vehicle to operate in 2024 is the shopping cart. You've seen all these. And then BRICS just finishes up their meetings, and they're saying they want to include silver now as one of the base metals for their currency, along with gold and platinum. So you start to look at this and say, wow, you can understand there's a few things happening, but why are they all happening right now? This is such a gargantuan change in world history. And you know it better than I on the political side of, ebbs and flows of different chapters and eras of our civilization going back 5,000 years or so. But why now? Because you look at different places around the world and you see distinct changes. It's literally like a line in the sand, a mark that demarcates that was then, this is now. And that line is so distinct, especially in Europe. If you travel around looking in the museums, that changeover from the Greek to Roman era, destroyed statues, like they had really demarcated. That had ended, and we are starting anew again. So I believe we are starting anew again right now, and we're in the process. It's not going to be a one-day event where, wow, it just changed, but it's a series of events that has unfolded, and is still in progress. And the end date, I don't really know when this transition period will finish, but we know we're in the amplification phase right now.
I mean, yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, just looking at the BRICS winding down, checking out some of the speeches and documents, and there's a clear line in the sand. We've crossed the Rubicon. We're transitioning from one phase to another. It has begun. And just on the cost of living, my little napkin calculation from my vantage point here in Mexico, from what I see and experience and talking with friends and neighbors, we realized recently, for example, property prices in the last 10 years in Mexico, at least where I am, have tripled. So they've gone up 3 times in 10 years. Food has doubled, kind of, as you say, but wages have either stayed the same or decreased, which is, I mean, this is all insane. This makes no sense whatsoever. But we're here to get, I like to call it the David DuByne download. So, wherever you'd like to start, there's so much going on. There's the stuff going on in Carolina, near to, I think, where you are, World War III, the economy, this transition phase. As I like to say, give us your theory of everything.
Oh, that's easy. Just string it together. Hey, I wanted to talk about Croatia for a second because, I told you before in our first time we talked, I was going, I really love the country. So we decided to go back for New Year's of this year, just at the beginning of 2024. And as we were there, it was the very last weeks to turn in the kuna. And everybody had moved over to 100% euros. So what had happened is people were super angry that they couldn't get access to the bank because the only place that the last couple of weeks you could turn it in was actually the central bank in Zagreb. But it was coming into the holidays, so a lot of things are closed. Talking to the shop owners and things, for them also, just in general, the entire price of things just rose astronomically. And then some of the restaurants that we enjoyed last time we went back to, and talking to the owners, were saying that they were forced to buy squid from Spain instead of getting it just down coast because of those reciprocal import agreements, that they had to buy something delivered completely across the continent when they could have got the same exact product a couple hours away and supported local businesses. But under these new agreements, they were forced to, and everything just is really expensive. And seeing it firsthand where something just went from, relatively normal prices to whoosh, almost doubling, and everybody's seeing it literally overnight when the native currency finished being used at all. That's really when these price holds, grabbed in. And I don't see the rest of the world being able to handle that if it were to increase, because then you need to look at the political stability of food pricing in general, and then cost of living getting so high people can't afford anything else. So there is no entertainment and people are getting angry. And I watched one of your interviews here. What was that? Clive Thompson. Mm-hmm. And in the beginning, he talks about, people in Switzerland, you need to really work your tail off because there's 50 people in line behind you that want that high paying job. They want that very well-to-do country to live in. And it's coming down to this too. But if it's all work and no play, not because you're 50 people behind you, but because it's so expensive, every moment of your time is sniffing out resources so you can pay your basic daily needs. And, we're getting rather close to this in so many nations where it's at the point, if it goes very much higher on anything in cost of living, then you're going to cross that other magic line too, where people just won't be able to afford basic life, and it does get kind of boring where all you're doing is work because you need to pay rent, you need to buy food, and there's nothing else. There's no holiday, there's no downtime, there's no going out to the restaurants. Everything will, and at what point does it upset the global balance? And then looks like you talked about, what countries could you relocate to that might have a better advantage where their prices may remain more stable, there's better food choices, and they're not going to get hit with some sort of super inflation event.
Yeah, I mean, just you talking about the kuna right behind me, I've just got a few, I guess they're souvenirs now, Croatian kuna bills. And when that happened, I felt like my nation died, honestly, like in my heart, because that was our national currency. And if you don't have a national, you don't have a nation, in my opinion. And the EU is this supranational imperial globalist beast. And so we've been just eaten up by the blob. And so for me, my nation has died. And then I've got, boots on the ground. Some of my listeners and subscribers, they're all over the planet. And maybe he's listening now. Shout out to one of my paid subs. He was he's a businessman. He was somewhere in Europe, I think last year. And he sent me an email of this story. The clerk of the hotel was a woman from Croatia. And he started a discussion with her and said that basically she confirmed that so many Croatians are fleeing Croatia because, as you were alluding to, no good work, high cost of living. The housing is, again, high, is everywhere. It's high from Mexico to Europe. So I think this is intentional. The BlackRocks of the world want to price the middle class out of owning property. And so, yeah, they're fleeing to Ireland. Croats are mostly going to Ireland these days, in Germany. And so it's a difficult situation. And so, yeah, your further thoughts on where we are and where we're going.
Well, the food production losses are going to continue because as I've been surveying the news, especially in these last couple of months, there's these massive programs now to have people rip up their crops and not plant. And you saw in France, they were taking away 30,000 hectares of wine growing regions, different vineyard areas that they were paying them now to cut the vines, till it back under, turn it into a rewilding project. But, that 30,000 hectares, which is over 60,000 acres, was more than the entire wine production of Switzerland. And you're starting to see this again and again. And then over in Spain, they wanted to tear down 1,000 acres of, production olive trees, this area, that next area, just to either put up windmills or solar panels. And it's either pay to stop farming or eminent domain land confiscation to put up these, green energy products. But whatever I see, every time they do it, it's in a place that there is food production. I mean, this is literally death by 1,000 cuts. We've had more than 500 food production facilities burned down in America here in the last 18 months, 24 months. And I'm sure it's the same around the rest of the world. Maybe we're just not seeing all this very targeted news on how many facilities have burned down across Europe, how many facilities have burned down across Africa or, Asia. But I'm curious, once this middle class gets usurped and it no longer exists, where do these people go? It's easy now to move if you have resources to go to another place. But at some point, if you don't have resources, where do you move to? I think that's a question I don't have an answer for.
No, I think, because I've got other just questions. Like I wanted to ask, why do you think they're doing this? Because it's democidal. It's like in some ways suicidal, but these elites have, they have their Elysium. They live in their city state, so they don't, and they're not national elites. They're international elites. So the UK elites who are destroying UK don't care about the UK. They're globalists that float around the planet. So I had a guest on not long ago who said, if in the old days, 80% of people used to live rural and like 20% urban, and that's flipped now. And UN's own projections, they talk about soon 70, 80% of populations living in urban areas. Urban areas will be the resilient cities, the smart cities. Would you argue, why do you think they're doing this? And I think, doesn't it make sense that people will just flood into the urban areas? That's what happened with NAFTA here, USA, Canada, Mexico. When NAFTA went up to something like 2 million of Mexican farmers were put out of work. They subsidized corn in the U.S., which beat the price for Mexico. And now millions of Mexican farmers have to leave rural areas and move into Mexico City, to Guadalajara, to Monterrey. And so that makes sense for you?
It does. And I think the plan, of this destruction of the world's food supply is to get us on a centralized system. Now, if I can walk people that are listening, your mind out here for a second, we're into a substantial change on the Earth's magnetic field. And what this kind of cavitation and movement of it has not been seen in multi-thousands, plural, at 6,000 years prior is the last time that we're seeing this much movement in the Earth's magnetic field. Declining as well, not increasing in strength, but declining. So you have to look at it as these areas 45 north and above across the planet are really starting to struggle very visibly now with their crop production in terms of wheat and different kind of oats. And if you come a little bit further south, the sorghum, these sort of, amaranth, these types of secondary crops. So if we're not going to be able to grow what we traditionally did in parts of Canada, northern parts of North America here, or in Australia down, the southern part there going toward the Antarctic Circle. China's struggling up in the Heilongjiang area, massive floods. So there's a huge amount of crop losses here. But where it's starting to rain? Northern Africa and the Sahel. There's a huge amount of rain. Everything's coming back in again. The deserts are beginning to green. There's a huge amount of stories on how much rainfall is coming down. And what I had heard and done an enormous amount of research on, first, they're going to be paying the workers coming through with central bank digital currencies, stable coins, because if you come from Chad or you come from the UK or you come from Argentina, it doesn't matter if you're working in the Sahel to set up these new grow zones, you're going to be paid in something where 1 = 1. So there's no, mix on the exchange rates when you head back to your home nation. And also with the global debt system, well, pretty much flat and very little, maneuvering. You can't really jam much more debt down anybody's throat, because at least where these nations have already, we grew up with that as a system to enhance our nations and expand them. It's kind of there's no more expansion where we've used, there's very little, you can't really ramrod it down there any longer. But if you were going to set up, say, the Sahel as a new growing zone, the multi-trillions of dollars that would be required for investment to put in road systems, waterworks systems, electrification. You got the new Renaissance Dam there in Ethiopia. That's Africa's largest hydroelectric project, and they're stepping 6 more down. And we're starting to see southern Sudan, massive floods everywhere across the Sahel, that whole area of Chad and Niger. And if you come all the way across there, some of the driest areas in northern Africa are becoming wet again. And their cities and villages followed the lakes that were drying out into these little pools of water, which were the previous African mega lakes. And now the rainfall is increasing and those lakes are starting to refill. But the problem is people have built right next to the shoreline following the drought over the last 40, 50 years down into the very bottom of the lakes. Those lakes are going to keep refilling. And the water levels are just going to get, deeper and deeper. And the possibility to restart the global debt system, control the food distribution of the planet, and that's where I see it moving to, is the ultimate control would be of food. Now, I can't really confirm it, but I heard some conjecture that the reason all these projects are going on for rewilding and buying out farms, et cetera, is to put the new growing zone in North African Sahel and control it as a single distribution point for the world's food supply. And if you don't play ball, then they would simply cut your country off, because they want to consolidate all the world's food production in North Africa, the Sahel, part of the Middle East, which is larger than North America and Canada combined, and they can get a double rotation crop. So I don't know, it keeps coming right back to food again. And I know it's a long answer to answer your question here, but the reason why I see it is food. And then to control for what purpose at the end? I never can come to that conclusion. Why? What's the final goal for the control mechanism?
So you will always know what's for dinner.
Yeah, just to add, I think if I don't forget his name, Larry Freeman. I've had him on the podcast. He's really great. He actually works with the folks doing the dam in, was it Ethiopia? So that's a great podcast people can check in the archive. And what you mentioned about the currency, the African Union, which is largely financed by the EU, because again, I've been saying for the longest time, the EU is the prototype. You've got Southeast Asian Union, so they're replicating that model in Southeast Asia, ASEAN. They want it in North America, Central America, South America, and EU is pouring billions into Southeast Asian Union to replicate it there. They're assisting, technical assistance, financial assistance, African Union to replicate EU in Africa. And there's something called ECOWAS, where they're trying to create, and that region you talked about specifically, the West African states, ECOWAS, where they're trying to create a common passport with these multiple countries and the common currency. So that speaks perfectly to what you're talking about. And William Engdahl, great author, I've had him on probably half dozen times at least on the podcast. He's still alive, but old and not in the greatest health. Doesn't really do podcasts these days. But he's mentioned that with his research and books that Africa alone could feed the world, which is interesting. And because it's so what's the word? I mean, there's so much, it can grow so much, and it's so fertile.
I'm wondering if it's just a cycle through time that we're experiencing, and our history has been manipulated, where we don't have all the facts, that this circle from serfdom to where we have achieved some level of autonomy as a human, being able to think on our own here, and then the collective being still controlled, but the individuals allowed to have free thought and express that thought, all the way back down, and that's torn away from us and brings us right back to feudalism again. And I'm just conjecturing, maybe it is woo-woo. Is it an 800-year cycle that comes back again? And our history that we have been told, there's missing bits of it here, there, and everywhere, that to achieve that goal, they're going to have to rip and tear down our society back to the bedrock and rebuild it. But there's going to be a lot of people like me that aren't going to be too happy with that. So, will it take one generation to reset it? 2 generations? And there's going to be a lot of people that have seen the previous world that we used to live in. They're going to be like, wait, this one we're going to is a far worse choice. I'd prefer to take my chances back a decade or 2 ago in the world that was evolving then. So we've seen before and after, and there's how many people on the planet have seen before and after? Like you and I, every year we're getting older and older, and another 30 years or something, we're going to be the old grumpy people that go, why are you always going? But we've seen both worlds. But the new kids born now, or the people who were born 20 years ago that are finally cognitive enough to be able to go, all right, well, this is happening in the world. And they kind of process the information. They never saw that old world. So for them, they're born right into this. This world is going to split, and they're taking us to this course. But to burn down the world, how many generations will the reset take? And did they know there would be some sort of natural cycle coming in at this point right now, where they could achieve that goal in a much faster, smoother fashion because of electromagnetic changes on the planet, the Earth's magnetic field declining? Could they ride on top of a natural disaster cycle to achieve it? I'm just throwing those questions out there for anybody who has an open mind to think.
Let me just pull out this book right behind me. I got this on the recommendation of one of the listeners and former guest, Matt Smith, shout out, who works with Doug Casey, who's been on the show. Global Crisis, War, Climate Change, and Catastrophe in the 17th Century. Massive book, but I think
I need to read that one.
But he talks about how I haven't read it yet. I've had it for like a year or 2, but the idea that these cycles affect, these natural cycles of climate affect the political and economic systems and empires, and maybe on that, to get your further thoughts. Do you, climate change, do you view this as these natural climate cycles? What are your thoughts there?
Well, first, when we talk about changes on the planet, pollution is one of the worst things. And you're talking about microplastics and forever chemicals and, oil spills, and these things are real and they have a very damaging effect. But when you're talking about a trace gas that's 0.04% in the atmosphere that's supposed to be cooking the planet, that doesn't make sense for me. Water vapor from the Hunga Tonga eruption putting 14% more moisture in the atmosphere with a very active, unbelievably ramping up solar maximum that we're entering, and the water vapor canopy driving global temperatures, that makes more sense. Higher solar activity and 14% more moisture, because water vapor is one of the most, say, potent heat trappers, for a better term. So think about it. You would have to know the cycle's coming back again. And who has this knowledge? Because I also wonder about the late 1600s, after the little ice age and the modern minimum, right around that 1640 era, when that began and was really at its depths, where you could almost follow. If you go back and look where the witch trials were across, there's different kind of proxies that you can use. So there's witch trials, and Slovenia had the most witch trials when you're looking at that 300-year period that culminated and ended in like mid 17 or prior to, say, the 1730, when that kind of all tapered off there. The witch trials, the most density of that was in Slovenia. So for me, if you're going to blame somebody or a group of people for the weather changing because they're doing spells and hocus pocus, whatever that the church had said they were doing at the time, then that would be one of the most greatly affected areas in Europe when these changes come. So I'm starting to look at these as sort of proxies. Okay, where was the second most witch trials happening? Oh, Austria. Okay, so you start to go, oh, well, those are mountainous ranges. Perhaps something had shifted in the glaciers, or, so I start to look at it, and then the amount of people who passed away during the time, there's gaps in records too, even in what we consider England, gaps. Like, you don't have a 10-year gap in England. Well, what happened? Well, they started raising smaller animals, obviously, because cows were requiring too much food, so they moved down to goats. There's this whole transition of animal husbandry during these times too. But the funerary rites, the invoices from the monks to do funerary rites on how many candle cases they ordered, also gives you an indication of, the population at the time and how much it declined. So that's not a long time ago. We're talking merely 300, 350 years prior. They had so much upset. The entire climate system ripped apart to the point where they're blaming women and burning them, putting them in prison and whatever else the church did at the time, because the weather changed, because the climate changed. And we're supposed to be the only ones ever in the last million years that changed the climate. Well, I would say, look back 300 years ago and see what happened. It was a tumultuous time on our planet. There was how much shift really occurred from the old world at that time, since like 1550 to 1600, and then fast forward into 1700, they went through a tremendous reset. That old world that they knew in like this year 1600 into the year 1700, that we're in a completely different world at that point. Technologically as well, government overseership, law, all these things had changed like that in just an instant.
What do you think then this phase transition, if you extrapolate, will look like? I keep having images of Hunger Games, Maze Runner, Mad Max. I mean, they just came out and said mainstream. I use only mainstream sources. I don't use People's Voice or different weird forums. Mexican papers said they're going to start dividing Mexico City, massive 25 million plus. They said they're going to divide Mexico City into multiple 15-minute cities. What do you think this new epoch is sort of going to, the outlines of what it will look like in your mind? Will it be something like that? Or, James Howard Kunstler, who I've had on the podcast, talks about world made by hand. So it'll be more like horses and donkeys and carts or what?
Well, if you're going that way, see, we're back into the 800-year loop then, because we're right back at serfdom and feudalism in the way that people were so slow to transport goods, etc. And I'm just wondering if the cycle's been played before and that fingerprint sits across it over the millennia, that we're just being given a false history, at least to a point. The areas that we grow food are going to have the greatest upset. So when you look at a producing country that's now gone offline, I'll use Ukraine for a second, but it's in a war. So once the war stops, we can rebuild the infrastructure there to bring it back to the former great breadbasket it was, but that's going to take more than a decade. You look at how much damage has been done there. I mean, you're not going to repair that overnight. You're not just going to put up another fence and then, hey, we're back up to the, 30 million tons for export out there available. Hey, that is absolutely going to take a decade or more. And, the amount of investment to go in there, as any war scenario, the rebuilding process that's also involved. I see a bunch of little skirmishes across, like Myanmar's another one. Did anybody out there know in the 1960s, Myanmar produced more rice than China? They were the leading rice producer in Asia. But right now they're only using about I'll just say 50% of their arable land. Like they can double and expand again another 50% of all the land usage. But a lot of place where there's different tribal groups up there and ethnicities that don't want to get off the land now. But wait, the plan is if they want to turn that back into a breadbasket, those people need to get out of there. Eminent domain. So you don't ever really own your land. So to have this like bastion and pull back position, it can be stripped from you in a second. So I just see these different regional areas where food production is being affected, going further offline. And I'm just wondering when that awareness rollover is, we might not grow enough food on the planet this year to feed all, I don't know if there's 8 billion people any longer after what happened through the last few years, but 7 billion. There's going to be an awareness moment, and it's all going to be revolving around food. And then, how do they take that, these global elite, and how do they run with that and twist it and sew it into a fear-based, the shortage. You got to come here to this city, to this distribution point. Time frame, again, I don't have a time frame on that, on expediency or how rapidly it can be implemented, and everybody falls under the umbrella.
I'm curious as to, I don't know the answer to this question. I've had a lot of interesting folks on the podcast over the years. Gail Tverberg of Our Finite, I think, blog, Steve St. Angelo, many other folks. I don't really buy into the peak oil thing. Hubbard came up with that.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in abiotic oil, but I still think, it can make sense that we can maybe reach some limits when it comes to resources. Do you think that there are limits to resources, or that elites are artificially shutting things down, or maybe, as you mentioned, the solar cosmic stuff is affecting everything?
Well, I would start back when we came off the bimetallic metal system and moved from gold and silver daily usage in, say, the 1850s here in America, and it just went to gold in early 1900s, and that was it, and they removed that silver facet out of it. I believe every single step of that way for the last 120 years has been completely controlled to devise plans to create that scarcity from day one until now. Have you ever flown on an airplane and you look down and there is almost nothing between those cities that you're flying to? And nature is bountiful, and it's voracious, and it just fills space. Myself having a farm, one little tiny seed, it's going to grow more than you can possibly eat, depending on what vegetable species it is. But also, we are battling every single year to keep our fields clean, because as soon as you let that go, like in one season, it's flat, nice mowed grass, field grass, and you come back, and if you didn't take care of it, it's overhead high with the weeds in one season. And nature produces so much, endless. And if you want to go on the abiotic oil theory, well, then you would also need to go to primary water, which is part of the whole North African Sahel plan. Is the above ground water resources are absolutely increasing. Now, some would point to the West African monsoon, and to take a look at that pattern, it's a 4,000-year pattern. The amount of rain flow, and I've been tracking all these massive floods across Saudi Arabia, the right up tucked right to the Red Sea. So this massive amount of flooding seems to be happening in Western Saudi Arabia, right along the Red Sea. Like all these points from Mecca all the way down to Yemen are just, once in a 1,000-year floods, every single storm. So for me, it seems like the track, the way the wind would go, because, there's 5,000-foot mountain range right along the Red Sea there as you come off the coast, seems to be direct versus coming down parallel, or it wouldn't capture that rainfall. But they have to also tap the underground water resources. And Gaddafi did that in Libya and was really starting to experiment with that water. And he was tapping into that primary water source. Like, we are fed the illusion that the only water that exists on the planet is just what's here on the surface in our lakes and rivers. But what about under your feet? Like, just the Nubian sandstone aquifer had something like 15,000 cubic kilometers. And then you go over to the Sus aquifer, which is another 12,000 cubic kilometers. And those are little tiny dots within Africa itself, North Africa. And then you look at there's hundreds of thousands of cubic kilometers of water that's never been tapped there. And it's very interesting with the sandstone there, because it fills in from the Atlantic Ocean, it fills in partially from the Indian Ocean, and then at the top there, it can come in from the Mediterranean, versus ours in the North American areas here, where it can only come from the Pacific Ocean for the refill, and maybe Gulf of Mexico, depending. So this scarcity that's been sold to us, We should have been using different patents for atmospheric harvesting of electricity, because I went to that Nikola Tesla laboratory in Zagreb, and they actually have working models of motors that spin against each other using magnets. Magnets. You know, when you're a kid and you push them together and they would repel? Well, you put discs in when they spin. You do the same thing that you would need to burn coal to create the pressure to get a spindle to spin. Working models in the laboratory there, Nikola Tesla laboratory right downtown in Zagreb. And nobody's thought to, in the last 140 years, to go ahead and experiment with these. We have been sold scarcity. There is not scarcity. There is delivery system, and overcrowding is what we've been like corralled. When I was say corralled, we've been corralled into that. This earth is so abundant. Tremendously, it would boggle your mind how abundant our earth is. And what we're not getting told is what's beneath the crust that continually refills. I would agree oil. I would agree water as well. But again, those are finite resources, aren't they?